My name is Christopher Poles, and I'm from Monroe County, New York. I'm a proud MPLD fellow and a child and family service specialist for New York State Office of Children and Family Services. Today, I'm going to talk with you about refugees in the child welfare system. Now, although my research was focused on refugees, a lot of this information can be related to immigrants, asylum seekers, and the undocumented population. A little bit about me. This is my beautiful family. But before I worked for the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, I worked for Monroe County Child Protective Services for over 6 years. During that time, I came in contact with many different children and families. I was out in the community. I was knocking on doors, and I came across many diverse cultures. Many cultures that were used to American customs, and some cultures that were not used to American customs. And these families that were not used to American customs, they really stood out to me because things were going on in the house that I just wasn't used to seeing. Not necessarily that things were wrong, I just wasn't used to seeing them. For example, a mother who had 10 children in the home, and she had plenty of space for extra beds, and they only had 3 beds in the house. And of course, as Child Protective Services, I can offer her more beds, and I did offer her more beds. But the mother refused these beds because this is what she was comfortable with. She was comfortable with her and her family all sleeping together, sharing 3 beds. Or the family who had a very sick child. The family takes the young child to the doctor, and the doctor says, "This is what's wrong with your child. Here's the medication that you need to provide your child for your child to get better." The family refused this medication. Now that the family knew what was wrong with their child, they knew how to fix their child. They had their own methods of fixing their child. The 17-year-old who was responsible for all the discipline in the home of his younger siblings, even physical discipline. Or the mother who wouldn't even speak to me unless given permission by her husband. And it didn't appear to be out of fear, it appeared to be out of respect for her husband. These situations were uncomfortable to me because I just wasn't used to seeing them, but they were happening more and more and more. And when processing this with my supervisors, we were confused at times on what we should be doing. Is this safety, or is this just something that we're not used to seeing and that we as a child welfare system are uncomfortable with? So I knew when I had the opportunity to do this action research project, I wanted to look further into the refugee community and the child welfare system. So here's an agenda for today. First, we're going to go over some definitions. Then we're going to go into my research, and then methodology and my intervention and those findings. Then we're going to talk about some obstacles I faced and lessons learned. So the lack of understanding does not hurt as much as the lack of effort to understand does. When I started looking into this topic of refugees in the child welfare system, I quickly realized that no one is talking about this here in the United States. There's very little research in the United States and when it comes to refugees and their interaction with the child welfare system. There's plenty of research in the UK, and there's a lot of research in Australia. But here in the United States, we're not really having this conversation. And we need to start having this conversation and learning about the many different cultures right here in our own country. So we'll start with some definitions. A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. And an immigrant is a person who's made a conscious decision to leave his or her home and move to a foreign country with the intentions of settling there. Cultural competence. Cultural competence is the ability to understand and interact effectively with people from other cultures. So, what does it look like to be culturally competent? Someone who's culturally competent, or an organization that is culturally competent, they value diversity, right? They conduct self assessments, meaning they look within themselves, they look at their own biases, they look at their own cultures, and understands how that impacts their interaction with others. They manage the dynamics of difference. They acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge, and they adapt to different cultures and diversities in their community. And being culturally competent doesn't happen overnight. It's not a training that you take and then you're all of a sudden culturally competent. It's a developmental process. It's a continuum learning, and each person and organization is at various levels awareness and knowledge of cultural competency. Refugee migration is increasing worldwide, and these families are at risk of becoming involved with the child welfare system. There's this cultural divide. Parenting styles are different. Parenting expectations are different. For example, many refugees and immigrants come from countries where physical discipline is generally accepted, and our Western parenting styles are seen as too relaxed, too permissive. Also, what constitutes acceptable behavior is different, which is why discipline and parenting styles in one country can be seen as abuse in another country. So there tends to be this cultural divide. And what we're seeing in here in America is that refugees and immigrant families are coming in contact with the child welfare system because of things like abuse as a result of physical discipline, maltreatment as a result of lack of supervision at times, and domestic violence. Refugees and immigrants, they make up 1/4 of the total population in the United States. And what we do know is that children with foreign-born parents make up 9.6% of the children that come in contact with the child welfare system. And like I told you before, the research is very limited, but we do know that refugees typically have language barriers, lower levels of education, and higher unemployment rates. And these variables can lead to poverty, refugee parents not being able to provide for their families, which will likely result in a CPS report. And yes, refugees and immigrants have many of the same needs as other families, but they face unique challenges that child welfare system is not making an effort to understand. So knowing that there's a large population of refugees and immigrant children, knowing that there's a percentage of children coming in contact with the child welfare system, and knowing that there's this cultural divide and certain barriers leading to refugee coming in contact with the child welfare system, I pose this following research question. If child welfare staff in Monroe County receive training on how to be more culturally competent for working with immigrant and refugee families, and receive information on cultural specific agency partners, will they report a greater likelihood to use a more trauma-informed, culturally competent, solution-focused lens to engage families? So answering my research question, my PICO question, required me to dig deep into what research is out there and doing my own research. So the next several slides will cover what I learned. I first started with learning more about my own county, where I spent so much time in the community. So Monroe County, we're located in upstate New York. We're one of 62 counties in New York. And right in the middle of Monroe County is the city of Rochester. And what's important to know about the city of Rochester is that Rochester is a sanctuary city, which means we limit our cooperation with immigration laws. And this is very important to know when working with refugee and immigrant families who may be afraid of potential deportation. Monroe County is the third largest county in New York where refugees resettle at 133 in 2021. These numbers have decreased over the last several years due to limiting refugees and immigrants into the United States and COVID. However, in 2016 and the years prior, this number was over 1,000 refugees and immigrants each year in Monroe County alone. And now that our borders are starting to become open again and welcoming to refugees and immigrants, these numbers are going to start increasing. This chart shows the top 6 countries refugees are migrating from, with Afghanistan being the highest, then the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Burma, Ukraine, and Sudan. And I would suspect that when the data is released in 2022, the Ukrainian number will be higher. So I gathered a lot of information on refugees for my in-depth literature review. A lot of information on refugees, which a lot of it was about the 3 stages of trauma, which I will explain later. I also gathered information on the child welfare system and the interaction between the child welfare system and the refugee community. At the same time, I was conducting interviews. I spoke to 5 service providers who work specifically with the refugee community in Monroe County. 2 of these providers were refugees themselves, and I wanted to know what services they provided, how long these services lasted, what their perception and knowledge of Child Protective Service was, and how Child Protective Service can best engage with the refugee population. I also had 2 interviews with young adults who had refugee status. What I wanted to know from them is if they felt comfortable sharing. I wanted to learn where they came from, how they got to America, right? What life has been like since they've been here. I wanted to know their experience with child protective systems and the child welfare system, and their perception and knowledge of the child welfare system. I also wanted to know how the child welfare system, specifically Child Protective Services, can best engage with the refugee community. When I dug into the research, it was clear to me that child welfare is overwhelming. The child welfare system is overwhelming. The child welfare system is overwhelming to America. So imagine having communication issues and a lack of interpretation and translation services. A refugee or immigrant is unlikely to trust or engage with government entities. Refugees may have left their home country due to harsh regimes or corrupt government. So they may have a very valid reason for not trusting or engaging with government agencies in the U.S. It is important to understand the 3 stages of trauma. The 3 stages of trauma is talking about trauma refugees may face in their home country during their travel to safety and when resettling in their new country. That first stage of trauma talks about extreme violence as a result of war and loss of life between family and friends. It talks about extreme poverty and lack of basic needs and displacement. That second stage of trauma talks about the travel, which also can be a great time of stress. The journey can take months and be harsh and extremely dangerous. Children can be separated from their parents on accident or by strategy. Some parents are paying smugglers to get them to safety, or if they do not have enough money for the entire family, they're paying smugglers to take their own child to safety. So imagine that trauma and stress there, being separated from your child or a child being separated from their parent. That third stage of trauma occurs when resettled into the new country. The family is in a society they don't know. They have little resources and very little support, if any. A lot of refugees are resettling in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. They left violence and poverty to resettle in neighborhoods with violence and poverty. As a child welfare worker, it is our job to ensure the safety, permanency, and well-being of every child we encounter. But safety, permanency, and well-being, it must be understood through a cultural and trauma-informed lens. When I spoke with service providers, I found that many of them are not having conversations about the child welfare system with the families that they're working with. One provider told me that she lets the families know that she works with that child protective service agencies, you should avoid them because they can take your children away. I appreciated her honesty for telling me that, but I took that opportunity to explain more of what the child welfare system can do. And that a very small part of our job is actually having to remove a child from their home. Our main goal is to try to keep the children in their home. But her saying that really speaks to the perception, not only refugees, the perception that people in our country have of the child welfare system. In speaking with service providers on their thoughts of the biggest challenges refugee families face, the responses really spoke to resettlement issues, that feeling of isolation and having to adjust to a new culture and leaving their own culture. One provider said one of the biggest challenges is the lack of support, that no one is here to represent them and they can't express their own views. This speaks to that culture divide that I've been talking about. I asked providers, how can the child welfare system best engage with refugee families? I really wanted to know what their take was on this question. Their responses supported my research. Providers talked about learning customs, building rapport, understanding the trauma and different cultural norms that we may not know or that we may not understand. I asked the two young men that I spoke to, what are some difficulties they encountered resettling in Monroe County? And again, their answers supported the research. These families are leaving a home or these young men are leaving a home that they know and have to try to assimilate into a culture they know nothing about by themselves with little support and little direction. Some other findings during my interview is that there's multiple service providers that are available in Monroe County that work specifically with refugees. So if you are a child welfare worker and you could potentially work with this population, I would strongly encourage you to look into what's in your own community that can provide services to refugee families. So some of the service providers that I found in my county, that in being a child welfare worker for over 6 years, I didn't know that they existed. But I talked to these service providers and I learned that they offered case management, they offered language classes, they offered job training, legal support, health wellness programs, sewing programs, youth groups, and more. The child welfare staff do not understand the trauma refugee families may have experienced. Again, I spoke to the 3 stages of trauma. And later on in the presentation, when I go over some of my results from my intervention, you will see what I mean. Refugee children learn American culture faster than their parents due to being in school and having to socialize. This can cause conflict in the home between parents and children due to these cultural differences. This can also result in children being responsible for a lot of the communication their caretakers have with the outside world. And in some cultures, it's not uncommon for children to be in a parentified role, whether it be caring for younger siblings, working to assist with financial support, or any other task to help support the family as a whole. And working in child protective services, I do know that some of these behaviors can be frowned upon in certain situations or even be seen as abuse or maltreatment. So after my research and data gathering, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to create a cultural competence training for child welfare workers specific to the refugee population. So I did just that. I developed a cultural competency training for Monroe County child welfare staff. This training was held virtually with 9 child protective service caseworkers. I administered a pre-test, post-test, and a feedback survey. During the training, I presented an overview of key definitions, the 3 stages of trauma, and supporting research. We really dove into the 3 stages of trauma. We discussed what cultural competent casework looks like and preventive services in Monroe County that work specifically with the refugee and immigrant community. The training was about an hour and 15 minutes long. There were 9 participants, which consisted of 6 new caseworkers on the training team, 1 Child Protective Service supervisor, 1 Child Protective Service senior caseworker, and 1 Child Protective Service coach. So I had representation from many levels of Child Protective Services. For the pre and post test, I asked questions to see what caseworkers knew about refugees in general and what they knew about refugees in Monroe County. Each question I asked in the pre-test was answered with a higher accuracy rate in the post-test. For example, I asked how many stages of trauma may refugees face. 22% got the answer right in the pre-test, and 83% got the answer right in the post-test. I asked about the high number of refugees in New York State in 2021. 33% answered correctly in the pre-test, and 83% answered correctly in the post-test. Here are some more questions asked specific to basic cultural knowledge. Again, on the post-test, the percentages show that knowledge was gained in each area. Here are some of the results from the feedback survey administered. The feedback survey focused mainly on caseworkers' awareness and knowledge of refugee pre-training and post-training. The percentages you see on the slide indicates caseworker identifying a moderate to high awareness or knowledge of the statement. I'm going to point out a few. When asked about the 3 stages of trauma, 20% of the caseworkers reported a moderate to high level of awareness or knowledge of the 3 stages of trauma. When asked about how to be culturally competent, 50% reported a moderate to high level of awareness or knowledge. And when asked about resources available to refugees, only 17% reported a moderate to high level of awareness or knowledge. After the training, the attendees reported 100% of awareness and knowledge on all questions asked. So the data showed that my research question, my PICO question, was answered. Yes, training will help provide more culturally competent services to families who are refugees or immigrants. As I learned during my literature review and interviews, and as you can see from the results of the pre-test and post-test and the feedback survey, it is unlikely that child welfare staff are familiar with refugee population. The child welfare workers can and want to develop their skills and knowledge and awareness of cultural competency. I was told by the group after my training that even after our discussion at the end of my training, they had another hour-long discussion about how they can be more culturally competent and how this will translate into their work with refugee families. Cultural brokers and community leaders are critical to assist with bridging that gap, and they are most connected to and trusted by the refugee and immigrant community. I relied heavily on these cultural brokers to connect me with the people that I interviewed. And when speaking with service providers, they're eager to learn more about the child welfare system, and they want to connect with the child welfare system. So there can be this collaborative effort to assist the refugee community who come in contact with the child welfare system. Some of the obstacles that I faced, the data is deficient in refugee family feedback. Again, I relied heavily on providers and community leaders to make connections with the refugee family, and finding families to interview were challenging. The service providers and community leaders did reach out on my behalf. However, just very little families responded. In New York State does not track refugees who come into contact with the child welfare system. So as a result, it is unknown if there's any disproportionalities, it's unknown if there's any patterns I could have discussed in my intervention or tried to address. So what's next for me? I'm going to continue my efforts to bridge that gap between refugees and child welfare system. I need to collaborate with service providers and do some community outreach. Because I'm a familiar face to refugee families, or become a familiar face to refugee families, and take the opportunity to learn more about their culture and to explain the child welfare system. I want to continue gathering data and piloting and improving on my training. And I would like to expand my training across New York State and nationwide. My MPLD journey. I started my MPLD journey at the right time during my transition from Child Protective Service caseworker for Monroe County to the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. My individual development plan really helped me find my voice in a room full of leaders. I now know a supportive network of leaders across the nation that look like me, and that action research project process model is fantastic, and I will definitely use it for years to come. So thank you for taking the time to listening to my action research project, and I hope I've left you inspired to continue to do this work for the child welfare system and the refugee community. Thank you.